This is Alfred Decker with 12 Principles of Permaculture Design, and today we're going to talk about the principle produce no waste and how it relates to worm composting. Aight? Hey, you know what? Worms are cool. They breathe oxygen like we do, and they exhale carbon dioxide. They even look like some of us, yet they suffer from a great lack of respect from us humans. For worm composting, we're using a kind of worm that comes from California. They eat more than other worms, they have better sex than other worms, and they like the good life. So we want to give them the conditions they like. Not too hot, not too cold, not too wet, not too dry. They're Californians after all. So a good composting process needs both carbon and needs both nitrogen. Now here in the city, we have plenty of both. For instance, when I'm walking around the old city center of Barcelona, I'm constantly seeing newspapers and cardboard thrown out on the street. Great source of carbon. Now, nitrogen, we also have plenty of. Food scraps. Food scraps are very high in nitrogen. So what we can do is collect in a bucket in our kitchens our food scraps and then later add them into our compost worm bins. You know, there's really only a few rules to make sure you have a good worm composting process. One rule is to make sure that the material isn't too wet, and you can assure that it's not too wet by putting in a sufficient amount of cardboard. On the internet, there's 100 different ways that you can make at low cost a worm bin for your balcony or your kitchen or your garden. And so I'm not going to go into too many details except to say that remember, you need to have some airflow in your compost process. Another rule is that you don't want to put too much of any one material in your compost bin. Remember, the lasagna. We want layers, say about this high, of different materials. If you put too much cardboard or newspaper, it can clump together and make a barrier through which the worms can't pass. If you put too much food scraps in, it'll turn nasty and stinky and it won't compost well because it contains so much moisture. So again, not too much of any one material. Another problem with composting is our flies. How to avoid flies? Hey, it's easy. In our worm composting bin, we just make sure to not keep food scraps uncovered on the top of the compost bin. So you know, there's really only a few things to avoid putting into your worm composting bin. One are citrus peels. So for instance, oranges, limes, lemons, don't throw the peels in because they'll take too long to decompose and they're quite acid and the worms don't like that. Aight. So now I'm going to take some worms that I've already had going here in my worm composting bin. So I'm going to put them in the bottom of the bed here. They're nice and cozy. Okay. And then I'm going to put some food scraps in, but I'm not going to add too many because in the very beginning, as the population is establishing itself, we don't want there to be too much heat from the composting process. And a lot of food scraps altogether can actually add so much heat in this closed space that the worms will die. And we don't want that. And then the next thing I'm going to do is to cover it with some carbon sources. And I'm going to do that because those are the two things we need to start this process. Any good composting process: nitrogen, food scraps, carbon from newspaper and cardboard, and then I'm going to make sure everything is moist by spraying it down, and then it's also covered this way with the carbon, and that way the flies can't lay their eggs. And that's it. And then, you know, we're just going to leave it for a few weeks, and I'm going to watch as the worm population grows, and slowly but surely I'll be able to add more food scraps and more carbon on in the lasagna fashion. And hey, we've got a worm bin. So this was an introduction video to worm composting. Obviously there's a lot more information out there, and we'd be happy to do a more detailed video if you want to leave your comments in the comment section below, as well as your questions. But the important thing is, don't be afraid to start experimenting and get your hands dirty playing around with the worms. And if you want to find out more information about urban permaculture, be sure to subscribe to our channel because we're going to be putting lots more material online soon. Later, Tater.